It wasn't the German U-boats strangling the Atlantic supply lines. It wasn't the relentless bombing of the Luftwaffe during the Blitz. It wasn't even the massive liquidation of overseas assets to pay for 2 world wars. It was a single number, a mathematical error so profound it shattered an empire from the inside out. It was the decision to prioritize pride over arithmetic. The pattern is unmistakable. We look at history and see battles, treaties, and elections. But the real history of the world is written in ledgers. It is written in the valuation of currency. When Winston Churchill walked into the Treasury in 1924, he wasn't facing a battlefield. He was facing a balance sheet. And the decision he made, the decision to return sterling to its pre-war parity, was not just a policy error. It was a mechanism of destruction. It forced a deflationary depression on the working class years. Before the crash of 1929, it broke the back of British industry. It turned the workshop of the world into a rusting hulk of uncompetitive pricing. The incentive was prestige. The incentive was to look the dollar in the eye. But the arithmetic is merciless. You cannot legislate value. You cannot decree by executive order that a currency is worth more than the economy backing it can support. When you try, the market breaks. The labor force breaks. The social contract breaks. This is not just a story about 1925. It is the story of every empire that tries to defy the laws of economics to maintain the illusion of dominance. The mechanism is always the same. The state overextends. The currency floats away from reality. The leadership attempts to force a correction, and the population pays the price in lost decades. Pattern repeats. It echoes through the halls of the Escorial in Spain. It screams from the printing presses of the Weimar Republic. And it culminates in the quiet, desperate rooms of the British Treasury. The variables change. The technology changes. But the math never changes. Current data suggest we are approaching a similar mathematical event horizon. The debts are unpayable in real terms. The currencies are detached from tangible value. The choice is coming again. Deflate and destroy the debtor, or inflate and destroy the saver. Churchill chose one. We are about to choose the other. To understand why, and to understand the gravity of the cliff we are standing on today, we have to look at the 3 times this specific tragedy has played out in the past. We have to look at the mechanics of the collapse, because the roadmap to the future is buried in the wreckage of the pound sterling. The first case study takes us back to the 16th century, to the very prototype of the Hollow Empire. Imperial Spain. Before we can understand Churchill's error, we must understand the Spanish mistake, because it established the fundamental law that political power cannot override economic gravity. In the 1500s, Spain was the undisputed master of the world. It held the Netherlands, much of Italy, the Philippines, and the vast resource-rich continents of the Americas on the surface. It was an empire of limitless wealth. Galleons arrived in Seville annually, their hulls groaning under the weight of silver from Potosi and gold from Mexico. But here is the mechanism of their destruction. The Spanish crown under Philip II confused money with wealth. They believed that the possession of precious metals constituted economic power. They failed to understand that money is merely a claim on productivity. And if you increase the supply of money without increasing the productivity of your farms and manufactories, you do not create wealth. You create inflation. This was the price revolution. The influx of silver acted exactly like a modern central bank printing press. It lowered the value of the currency relative to goods, but the Spanish crown had a specific incentive structure that accelerated the rot. They were engaged in endless multi-front wars against the Ottomans, against the Dutch rebels, against the English, against the French. These wars required massive liquidity. The silver fleets provided the liquidity, but they arrived only once or twice a year. The soldiers needed to be paid every month. So the crown borrowed. They borrowed from the Fugger and Welser banking families of Germany and the Genoese bankers of Italy. They borrowed against future silver shipments. They leveraged their income before it even arrived at the dock. The debt grew exponentially, driven by the compound interest of emergency war loans. By the 1570s, The crown's interest payments alone consumed more than half of its revenue. The domestic economy of Castile began to fracture. Because Spanish silver was so abundant, prices in Spain rose faster than anywhere else in Europe. This is the critical point. The Dutch disease of the 16th century. A Castilian wool merchant found that his costs of living and production were skyrocketing. He had to pay his workers more. Because bread was expensive, he had to pay more for transport. Consequently, the price of Castilian wool cloth rose. Meanwhile, in England and France, where the silver had not yet flooded the market to the same degree, prices remained lower. Foreign goods became cheaper than Spanish goods. The rational move for a Spanish consumer was to buy imported cloth. The rational move for a foreign merchant was to stop buying Spanish exports. The domestic industry of Spain was hollowed out, not by a lack of money, but by an excess of it that rendered their labor uncompetitive. The crown responded not by cutting spending, but by defaulting. Philip II declared bankruptcy in 1555, 7156, 1575, and 1596. Each time the mechanism was a restructuring of debt that wiped out capital and froze credit markets. The Giro's government bonds became worthless. The banking houses that had lent to the crown collapsed. Consider the human element in this slow-motion train wreck. Picture a master weaver in Toledo in 1590. He is a man who has followed the rules. He runs a workshop that has been in his family for 3 generations. But every year he watches his order book shrink. He walks to the market and sees cloth from Flanders selling for half the price of his own. He cannot lower his prices because the tax collector demands payment in silver, and his workers demand higher wages just to eat. He is squeezed. Between the inflationary monetary policy of the empire and the fiscal demands of the state, he eventually closes his shutters. He dismisses his apprentices. The loon sits silent. He has been priced out of existence by his own government's monetary abundance. The flight to hard assets began. Those with capital stopped investing in productive enterprises like weaving or trading, which were taxed and risky. Instead, they bought land titles and government sinecures. They sought rent-seeking positions that offered tax exemptions. The middle class, the engine of any economy, was crushed. Spain became a nation of destitute peasants and idle aristocrats with nothing in between. The empire remained on the sheer wing, on the map for centuries, but the economic engine was dead. They had chosen the path of inflation and debt, believing their dominance would allow them to defy the laws of economics. They were wrong. Just like the Spanish Empire choked on its own silver, the British Empire 3 centuries later would choke on its own pride. This brings us to the core case study, the United Kingdom in the 1920s and the specific financial architecture of Winston Churchill's era. To understand the magnitude of this event, we must look at the world before 1914. London was the financial center of the globe. The gold standard was not just a policy. It was a religion. It meant that every pound sterling in circulation was backed by a specific amount of gold, 113 grains of pure gold to be precise. This fixed the exchange rate at roughly $486 US dollars to the pound. This stability allowed Britain to dominate global trade. It was the Pax Britannica. Then came the First World War. To fight a total war, Britain had to suspend the gold standard. They had to print money and issue debt to pay for munitions, soldiers, and supplies. They borrowed heavily from the United States. By 1918, the British price level had inflated significantly. The pound was no longer worth $486 in terms of purchasing power. In the open market, it was trading far lower, dropping to near $340 at one point, before stabilizing around $440. Enter Winston Churchill. In 1924, he was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer. He was not an economist. He was a historian, a soldier, and a romantic. He looked at the British Empire and saw a structure that required a strong currency to maintain its prestige. He was surrounded by the city establishment, the Bank of England, led by the formidable Montague Norman, and the Treasury officials. The incentive for the City of London was clear. They were creditors. They held bonds. They wanted those bonds paid back in good money, gold-backed money at the pre-war rate. If the pound was devalued, their assets were devalued. They argued that if London did not return to $486, the world would lose faith in Britain. Banking supremacy would shift permanently to Wall Street. But there were dissenting voices. John Maynard Keynes argued ferociously against it. He pointed out the merciless arithmetic. If the pound was actually worth $440 in terms of labor and goods, but the government arbitrarily fixed the price at $486, British exports would instantly become 10% more expensive to the rest of the world. To make British goods competitive again, at that high exchange rate, British costs had to come down. Since raw material prices were set globally, the only cost that could be cut was labor. Wages had to fall by 10%. Churchill was essentially voting for a 10% pay cut for every minor factory worker and dockhand in the country. Churchill hesitated. He held dinner parties where he grilled the experts. He asked, if we return to gold, will it cause unemployment? The Treasury officials assured him the adjustment would be temporary and manageable. They lied or they were deluded by their own models. On April 28, 1925, Churchill announced the return to the gold standard at pre-war parity. The trap snapped shut. The economic consequences were immediate and catastrophic. The British coal industry, already struggling with underinvestment, saw its export markets vanish. German and Polish coal was now cheaper. Mine owners facing bankruptcy did exactly what the arithmetic dictated. They demanded wage cuts and longer hours from the miners. The miners refused. Not a penny off the pay, not a minute on the day. This led directly to the general strike of 1926. For 9 days, the country ground to a halt. Transport stopped. Presses stopped. It was a social fracture of the highest order, born directly from a monetary decision. The strike was crushed, and the miners were forced back to work at lower wages, but the damage was structural. For the rest of the 1920s, while America roared with the Jazz Age and an industrial boom, Britain stagnated. Unemployment never dropped below 10%. The high pound acted as a suffocating blanket over the industrial north of England. Consider the life of a coal miner in South Wales in 1927. He is a man who survived the trenches of the Somme, only to return to a country that told him he was too expensive. He works deep underground in dangerous conditions, hewing coal that the world no longer wants to buy at the price his government demands. He brings home a pay packet that has shrunk, but his rent has not. He watches his children grow up in a town where the shops are closing. He listens to the radio and hears politicians in London talking about the soundness of the pound, about the integrity of the currency. To him, the integrity of the currency looks like starvation. He is the collateral damage of a financial abstraction. The Bank of England was forced to keep interest rates high to defend this artificial exchange rate. High interest rates meant no investment in new machinery or factories. British industry aged and rusted, while American and German industries modernized. The capital that should have gone into upgrading steel mills went into defending a number on a ledger. By 1931, the reality became undeniable. The global depression hit, and speculators began to attack the pound. The gold reserves drained away. The Royal Navy actually mutinied at Invergordon over pay cuts. The game was up. Britain was forced off the gold standard. The years of pain, the strikes, the hunger, the industrial decay, it had all been for nothing. The market won, the arithmetic won. Churchill later admitted it was the greatest mistake of his life. He had tried to buy prestige with the livelihoods of the working class, and he ended up losing both, just like Britain tried to defy gravity with deflation. Weimar Germany demonstrated the horror of the opposite extreme. The attempt to defy gravity with inflation. Churchill chose his path largely because he looked across the Channel and saw the smoking ruins of the German currency. He was terrified of becoming Weimar. The Weimar case study is the ghost that haunts every central banker. It is the story of a government that stripped of its ability to tax and borrow, turned to the only tool left, the printing press. In 1921, Germany was burdened with massive war reparations. They had to pay the Allies in gold or foreign currency, but the German government was weak. It relied on a fragile coalition of socialists, centrists, and monarchists. They did not have the political capital to raise taxes on the wealthy, industrialists, or the struggling workers. The path of least resistance was to print marks, to buy foreign currency, to pay the reparations, and to print marks to subsidize domestic industry to keep employment high. The mechanism of hyperinflation is often misunderstood. It is not just about the quantity of money. It is about the velocity. It is about confidence. For a while the printing worked. Germany had full employment, while the alignment. Rest of the world slumped in 1921, but the distortion was building. In 1923, when the French occupied the Ruhr Industrial Valley to extract unpaid reparations, the German government ordered a strategy of passive resistance. They told the workers to strike, and the government promised to pay their wages. They were paying millions of workers to produce nothing. The printing presses ran 24 hours a day. The currency collapsed. It went from 42 marks to the dollar to 42 trillion. But numbers are abstract. Let us look at the reality. The price of a cup of coffee would double while you were drinking it. Waiters would stand on tables to announce new menu prices every 30 minutes. The incentive to save was obliterated. If you were paid at 12 p.m., you had to spend every pfennig by 1 p.m., or your labor was stolen by the inflation. The flight to hard assets was total. People bought anything tangible. They bought pianos they couldn't play. They bought sacks of flour they couldn't eat. They traded family heirlooms for a side of bacon. The social fabric didn't just tear. It incinerated. The middle class, the professors, the civil servants, the pensioners, who had saved all their lives, were wiped out. Their savings, which could once buy a house, could now not buy a loaf of bread. Consider the human element. A widow in Berlin in November 1923. Her husband had died in the war. She lived on a government pension that was fixed in nominal terms. She receives her monthly check. It is for 1,000,000 marks. She walks to the bakery. The line is long. By the time she reaches the counter, the price of a loaf has risen to 2 billion marks. Her monthly pension is not enough to buy a single crumb. She is not poor because she is lazy. She is not poor because she is stupid. She is destitute because the store of value she trusted has been weaponized against her. She returns home, burns the banknotes in her stove for heat because they are cheaper than wood, and prepares to starve. This was the alternative Churchill feared. This was the abyss. And in his desperate attempt to avoid the fire of inflation, he marched Britain into the ice of deflation. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. It is visible in the Spanish silver crisis, the British deflationary trap, and the Weimar collapse. Stage 1 is the expansion. The empire or nation enjoys a period of genuine prosperity driven by productivity, technological advantage, or resource dominance. The currency is sound. Confidence is high. Stage 2 is overextension. The state takes on commitments it cannot afford. This might be imperial. Wars, as with Spain and Britain, or massive social programs. The costs begin to exceed the productive capacity of the tax base. Stage 3 is the shortcut. The leadership realizes they cannot pay for their commitments through honest taxation. The political cost is too high, so they choose a monetary shortcut. For Spain, it was debased silver. For Weimar, it was the printing press. For Churchill's Britain, it was the manipulation of the currency peg to feign strength. Stage 4 is the trap. The distortion enters the economy. In an inflationary scenario, prices rise. In a deflationary scenario, Churchill's choice, wages and prices are forced down, crushing the debtor. The economy begins to cannibalize itself. Productive capital is misallocated to survive the monetary manipulation rather than to create value. Stage 5 is the fracture. The population realizes the game is rigged, strikes, riots, and political extremism explode. The middle class is radicalized. In Britain, it was the general strike. In Germany, it was the beer hall putschs and street battles. The social contract is broken. Stage 6 is the flight. Capital flees the system. In Spain, it went to land. In Weimar, it went to foreign currency and hard goods. In Britain, Capital fled the industrial north and moved into government bonds or overseas havens, leaving the domestic economy to rot. Stage 7 is the reset. The system becomes unsustainable. The currency is revalued, devalued, or replaced. The debts are defaulted on or inflated away. The slate is wiped clean, but the wealth of a generation has been transferred or destroyed. Just like the British Empire in 1925, we are currently standing in the center of the trap. The mapping is imperfect, but the rhymes are terrifying. Current data suggests the United States and the United Kingdom are facing an imperial overhang similar to 1920s Britain, but with the debt levels of a wartime economy. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio is over 120%. The UK is not far behind. We have the overextension. Global military commitments, massive entitlement obligations, and interest payments on the debt that are beginning to rival defense spending. We have the shortcut. For the last 15 years, central banks have used quantitative easing, money printing, to suppress interest rates and monetize the debt. This is the modern equivalent of the Spanish silver influx. But here is the divergence. Churchill chose deflation. He chose to protect the currency at the expense of the economy. Today, that option is mathematically impossible if the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England were to attempt a Churchill to raise rates high enough to make the currency truly sound and pay down the debt in real terms. The interest payments would consume 100% of tax revenue. The sovereign would default. The entire banking system, which is loaded with government bonds, would insolvent. Therefore, the incentives dictate that we cannot choose Churchill's path. We are forced toward the Weimar path, though likely in a more managed, slow-motion form. The incentive is to inflate away the debt, to keep interest rates below the rate of inflation. This is financial repression. The warning signs are flashing. We see the flight stage beginning. Central banks around the world are buying gold at record rates, moving out of U.S. Treasury's smart capital is moving into land commodities and scarce assets. They are positioning for the devaluation. The counter-argument is often made, but the dollar is the world reserve currency. It has no rival. It cannot collapse like the mark or the peseta. This is true to a point. The dollar has exorbitant privilege. It has structural demand, but history shows that reserve currency status is not a shield. It is a dam. It holds back the pressure for a long time, allowing imbalances to build up to massive levels. But when the dam breaks, the flood is biblical. The British pound was the world reserve currency in 1914. By 1931, it was a wreck. Being the reserve currency does not prevent devaluation. It merely delays it, making the eventual adjustment more violent. The arithmetic is merciless. The debt cannot be paid in real terms. It must be defaulted. On the only question is the form of the default. There are three endgames. The first is controlled decline. This is the soft landing scenario. A government manages to keep inflation at 4 to 6% for a decade. This cuts the real value of the debt in half. It is a slow bleed for the saver and the wage earner. Living standards slowly erode. This is the path of post-imperial Britain from 1945 to 1979. Long gray slide into mediocrity. The second is chaotic collapse. The bond market revolts, buyers go on strike, yields spike uncontrollably. The central bank is forced to print trillions to buy the bonds, triggering hyperinflation. This is the Weimar or Venezuela scenario. It leads to total social breakdown and usually authoritarian political shifts. The third is reset and restructure. The major powers gather as they did at Bretton Woods in 1944. They agreed to devalue their currencies simultaneously against a new anchor, perhaps gold, perhaps a basket of commodities, perhaps a new digital ledger. The debts are written down or converted. The system restarts. In 1925, Winston Churchill tried to force the world to fit his nostalgic vision of the past. He failed. He ruined the British economy because he did not respect the constraints of reality. Today, our leaders are trying to pretend that debt doesn't matter, that deficits are free, and that we can print prosperity. They are making the same error, just in the opposite direction. The outcome will be the same. The market will eventually clear. The valuation will return to reality. The only variable is timing and pain. Subscribe to the channel. Do not rely on the official narrative. Educate yourself on the history of money. Build resilience in your skills, your community, and your assets. The storm is not coming. It is already here. We are just waiting for the dam to break.